Of course, there's some things I'm not crazy about with the incoming administration, but there's some things that I am cautiously optimistic about, because I find in politics and policy, cautiously optimistic is sometimes the best you can get, right?
Hello. Welcome again to another episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on a friend and someone who knows a lot about state spending and budgets, capping credit card fees, and just a lot of other good information, and just a good freedom fighter just in general. And it's none other than Tom Savidge. Tom, welcome to the Let People Prosper Show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Vance. Long-time listener, first-time guest.
There you go. Exactly. And a long-time friend. We were just talking before we went live here that, we've known each other for nearly a decade.
I can't believe it. Yeah.
When you were in the Coke Associate program and I worked with you then as a kind of a mentor sort of situation, but we've got into a situation now where we're friends, we're colleagues in the sense of focusing on free market capitalism and pushing ways to prosper. It's an extraordinary opportunity.
It is awesome. And yeah, I can't believe it. I blinked and I can't believe it's almost been a decade.
I know. We've had more kids now. You've had kids and all the stuff.
Yep. That's it. Yeah. A lot happens. Time flies when you're having fun, right?
No, exactly.
Yes.
So we got a lot to talk about, but before we get into all that, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience, and then we'll jump right into it.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas Savidge, is a research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, who does a lot of great work, also known as AIER, where I'm also a fellow there. He earned his master's in public policy from George Mason University, which is a great department there, and a bachelor's of arts in political science and philosophy from SUNY New Paltz. Prior to joining AIER, Tom was a research director at the American Legislative Exchange Council, another great group there, focusing on tax and fiscal policy. He was a co-author of several publications focused on public pensions, public retiree benefits, bonded obligations, tax and expenditure limits, and state taxes, all things we want to talk about today. In 2020, Mr. Savidge published a peer-reviewed study on Tennessee public retirement systems with the PERI Center at MTSU titled Tennessee Public Pensions, a Model for Reform. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes page as well, Tom. So with all that great stuff going on, and we got a lot to talk about today, let me go and ask you the first question I do all the guests. Why do you do what you do every day?
That's a great question, Vance. It's a long story. It's growing up. I grew up in the New York State public education system, which for anybody who knows, it's not the most freedom-friendly environment. I got very interested in politics, government, and policy. And for a while, I felt kind of politically homeless. I didn't quite agree with Republicans, but I also didn't quite agree with Democrats. And then when I was an undergraduate student, I got connected with groups like FEE, IHS, and started going to their summer seminars. And I said, hey, wait, these ideas are really speaking to me. And so from there, I started applying to different fellowship programs, like the Koch Summer Fellowship Program. That was back in 2014, which is, it was a decade ago now.
Yeah. Wow. And
there I did a summer fellowship with the Empire Center for Public Policy in Albany, New York. And, while my project was rating local government transparency and sort of grading them like on a report card, quite frequently, the folks at Empire Center were always talking about public pensions. And at the time, I thought, I'm 21. I'm not really thinking about retirement right now. Why do I have to worry about this? But when you look what's under the hood there, those unfunded liabilities, that is a real cost. It's eating away state budgets. It's eating away taxpayer dollars. And by the end of the summer, I was thinking, why isn't everybody worried about this stuff? And so that pushed my desire to go to grad school, to become a researcher. I did the Koch Associate program. That's where you and I met. And I worked with the Mercatus Center there as a program associate. Got my master's in public policy at GMU, as you mentioned. Tried the PhD program in economics for a year. Didn't earn funding for the second year. So I said, instead of taking on a ton of debt, I'm going to try my hand at the working world. And then worked at the Koch Foundation for a little bit, and then I was working at ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, where I really got to deep dive into these state debt issues, state tax issues, And I was there for about just shy of 5 years. And, you know, that was a really amazing opportunity to not just get to research these things, to do the deep dive into the actuarial documents, but also meet the policymakers and the folks who are seeing the inside of it, who are really on the front lines, and not just to educate them from my research perspective, but to learn from them as well. And that really helped build out my my research perspective and my understanding of government, the importance of freedom, the importance of federalism as well. And I carry that with me now in my role at AIER.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And you've been there for nearly a year.
Yeah, it's crazy. I can't believe it's already been a year. 2020, I feel like 2024, excuse me. Oh my goodness.
I know. And the thing is, so AIER does a lot of great work on federal and then state issues as well. And so you've been able to write on a number of things. We've co-authored a couple of pieces, which I hope that we could do more of that as we move forward.
Absolutely.
But I think that, you know, this was a great opportunity for you, and like you're in your career as you're moving to do different things. I mean, you did some great work at ALEC, and really defining the narrative about what states should be doing and highlighting what states should be doing right and what's not the right way to go, is always important. And so you get this other opportunity now to continue that and reach a different audience. Maybe some of them, maybe some of the same, but a broader audience as well, as you can now focus some on monetary policy and fiscal policy at the federal level. Is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I really get more into the federal fiscal stuff. But you know, it's interesting because the federal fiscal policy and federal spending is so pervasive in state budgets. Even when, you know, working at ALEC, you always have to keep at least one eye on what's going on in Washington. Because actually the average state budget gets about 35% of its expenditures from federal dollars, which, of course, let's call a spade a spade. It's all taxpayer money.
Right.
But it's those federal transfers. And those transfers, of course, come with strings attached. Yeah. And that dictates state policy, that dictates local policy when that money gets transferred down to the local level. And it's incredibly pervasive, and it erodes away federalism and erodes away individual freedom. But like you mentioned, being at AIER, I'm really getting to deep dive into those federal policies, specifically entitlements, looking at Medicare, looking at Medicaid, which is a federal and a state issue and a local issue as well. But then also too, like you said, AIER has a great monetary policy program, great monetary policy team. And I think one of the dangerous things that we're really seeing right now is that line between fiscal and monetary policy is really blurred. You know, it was blurring during the Great Recession. It really blurred in 2020 with that municipal liquidity facility buying up state bonds and all these sorts of other things that really the Fed has no business doing, regardless of how, you know, your listeners out there might feel about certain issues. The Fed should just be focused on monetary stability. And instead, there's so much mission creep going on at the Fed where it's now dabbling in fiscal policy. And at the same time, you have folks in the fiscal policy space really turning the screws to try to get the Fed to do what they want. As well. And you and I have actually gotten to write a little bit about that too, and how to fix that.
Yeah, no, we did. And I'll put that in the show notes page for sure. And I want to get into some of that, but, you know, a little bit more on your background and kind of your worldview of thinking about things, you know, for me, and you already know this, but, you know, for me, I come at it from like a Christian, biblical worldview, but also from a classical liberal perspective, more libertarian overall, but, you know, I have some conservative viewpoints as well. But in general, it's like, let's get government out of the way as much as possible, just preserve liberty, and that way people can prosper as much as they can. And that's at every level of government. But those Christian beliefs and principles are really important for me as well to kind of keep me humble, you know, and everything else as we go through this, because we don't have all the information, as Hayek would say, with the knowledge problem. We also want to make sure that incentives are in place such that the wrong people do the right things over time, as Friedman would say, and then that there's no solutions, only trade-offs, like Sol would say. I think, you know, over time, those three have been kind of the biggest influences on me over time, whenever I'm thinking about my philosophies and economics and everything else. But what about you, Tom? Who would you say are maybe some of your, where you get a lot of your insight from and kind of your worldview?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So it's kind of it's been an interesting journey throughout my education and my career. You know, for a while, like I had mentioned, I was politically homeless, and then I was sort of, you know, philosophically agnostic. And It's funny studying as a student of philosophy. It really brought me back into my faith because you appreciate how little you actually know about the world.
Yeah.
And, how the philosophical importance of, say, even something like the Bible as it is to Western civilization, to our understanding of human nature. And I think too, it's, I would say my sort of aha moment. I always go back to Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, the second chapter, the creative powers of a free civilization. And he's got a passage in there that compares the conscripted soldier and the vagabond. The conscripted soldier has everything provided for him. They tell him what to eat, when to eat, where to sleep, when to sleep. Everything, his day is planned out for him, but he doesn't have freedom. And he goes on to say the vagabond has total freedom, but, maybe the vagabond doesn't know where his next meal is going to come from. And Hayek has this line in there, and I'm probably going to butcher it because it's been a while since I looked at the book, but it's, freedom isn't just about guaranteed success. It's the freedom to fail, the freedom to starve. Yeah. And that really, I remember sitting in my apartment in undergrad reading that line and just feeling like, my mind was just blown. Like, wow.
Yeah.
It's like I had never heard it phrased that way. And it's, you hear about some of the straw man arguments against freedom where they're saying, oh, these proponents of capitalism might promise success, but success isn't guaranteed. Here's somebody who's one of the strongest advocates for freedom in history saying, of course it's not. And it really, it changed my perspective on, what our founding documents mean. Even something like the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. Pursuit of happiness. It's not guaranteed happiness. No. Pursuit of happiness. It's your ability to try, to fail, and pick yourself back up and try again as many times as you're willing to pick yourself back up.
Yeah.
That is that pursuit of happiness. I mean, I was just actually just talking about this on Newsmax last week about that chain restaurant Chi-Chi's coming back after 20 years. And it's in its own way, it's that's that pursuit of happiness. To try, to fail, and then come back as many times as you're willing to. And who knows if Chi-Chi's will survive or fail. Maybe we'll be listening to this in a year from now and things didn't work out, or maybe it'll be a nationwide success. We don't know, but that's what freedom is all about.
Yeah.
That ability to try and and that responsibility, you were in the driver's seat. And I guess that's sort of where I'm at too, where it's, I've come to realize that it's, God has a hand in everything, but I know that I found that I've had the most success where I believe that I am responsible for my successes or my failures.
Yeah.
That I am fully responsible for the consequences of my actions. So, that's about where I'm at.
Yeah, no, man, I love it. I love it. And, I remember when we were talking back, a few years ago, because you were working on your PhD, you were going to get a PhD for a while, and you decided, you know what, this isn't for me. And some might have taken it, and you might have even taken that as a failure at first. But I think that you grew so much from that over time that helped to get you where you are today. If you kept going down that route, who knows where you'd have been? Maybe you've been doing something great, but I think you've done a great job doing all the things you're doing and learning from those quote unquote failures. Because Tom, as you know, like I've failed a lot, and whether it be when I was in a rock band or doing that rock star life or a whole bunch of things, but to your point, like I learned from that and going back to Hayek, which I love that, by the way, it's really important for us to have those failures. And it's important not only in freedom, but like free market capitalism, not everybody is going to succeed. There needs to be failures in order for us to learn of what to do and what not to do. It's one of the reasons why socialism always fails is because it breeds mediocrity, because they don't want anyone to quote unquote fail. But then if that, of course, leads to worse outcomes for people along the way. And so I think going back to your story, Tom, is that it is a testimony, if you will, to the challenges that you faced and then you've overcome and then you're continuing to press for more, not only for you now, but even your kids. You've got two kids now. And so you've really seen that. And so I'm glad that you shared that. You've got a lot more to learn, just as I do, right? We're still continuing to fight for these freedoms and liberties and hopefully more prosperity across the, let people prosper, right?
Exactly.
But you're heading in a good direction. So I appreciate all you're working on.
Oh, right back at you, Vance. Like you said, it's a learning process, and really the mindset that's helped me the most in my career is to approach it as an eager intro student.
Yeah.
it's somebody, whenever I meet somebody, you have to look at it from the perspective, even if it's somebody I disagree with, which of course, sometimes that makes it harder, but you have to approach them as like, hey, this person knows something that I don't, and I have an opportunity to learn from them.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I do this perfectly every time. Of course, we're not all perfect, right?
Sure.
But, that really is the best approach. And it's really, really learning from that. Like you said, learning not just from, my own successes and failures, but, learning from the people you meet. And, that's the folks I met in grad school. Like, even in that PhD program, I did it for a year, but, I wouldn't do anything. Well, I wouldn't turn away that opportunity if I had the chance again, because, I learned a ton. I got to take classes with, some of the economic giants like Walter Williams, whose lessons I'm still applying right now. And I have to say, I always think like if I'm not using it, I lose it. So I have to go back to my notes, go back to those old exam questions and like, wait, what was he saying about this? Or what was, my macro notes from here? And, that I met some great friends in the program as well, who I'm still in touch with today as well.
Good.
And it really was an amazing opportunity. And, of course it wasn't a decision I made lightly, but
sure. No.
But yeah, I think it was, I've been very fortunate to have the path that I've been on. And, I don't regret any of the lessons, whether it's, you learn them the hard way or you learn them the easy way. It's, and you have to approach it as, you're always learning. I'm always learning something new. And, I'm sure, with 3 kids, I have 2 kids that for a good chunk of this year, I had 2 under 2. And, once you think you've got it figured out, then it all goes out the window.
That's right. Well, we've got a lot more to learn. And speaking of learning, on the policy front and the economy and everything else, I know that one of the lessons, of course, that we learn is history. And economic history is really important. And unfortunately, it seems like we're always wanting to repeat the failures of the past. To your point about excessive spending and the debt and the Fed and how much influence they're having on our lives and the economy and everything else. It's unfortunate. And I just wonder, where do you want to start today? We could talk about a number of things, Tom, but like what's top on your mind of what you would like to start on policy? And then we can kind of dig into that.
Well, sure. I think, first and foremost is spending, and closely tied with spending is debt. Yeah. Because I think those are the 2 big issues of the day, because that, whether it's the federal debt, whether it's the unfunded obligations from Medicare and Social Security, or the unfunded liabilities at the state and local level, or the quote unquote hard debt, which is the Treasury debt, the federal level, or those state and local bonded obligations. That's going to dictate, that is going to dictate policy for years to come. It's going to affect our kids and grandkids. It'll keep affecting society, long after you and I are out of the game. Yeah. Yeah.
What's wild about that too, Tom, is that, for years, if not decades, we've been dealing with an overspending, a debt problem at the federal level, and it's been bipartisan, right? I mean, this is Democrats and Republicans have contributed to that. And I had a nice chart that I would share pretty often about if you look at the presidents, whether they're Democrat or Republican, and then right underneath that, you look at Senate and House. And who was in power, red or blue, during those times. And it just kept going up no matter who was in charge, because nobody wants to confront the big issues like Social Security and Medicare, for example, or even Medicaid. But these are, and I bring that up because it seemed like they didn't really have an effect on our life. I mean, the inflation stayed really low for a long period of time. Interest rates weren't really that high. But now over the last couple of years, we've really seen inflation take off. We've seen interest rates being higher than we have in decades. And this has really hit the cost of living a lot. We just had an election. We're recording this in December. This is going to come out in January. So happy 2025. That's
it. Happy New Year.
Yeah, man. But we just had an election where the number one issue on people's minds was, you guessed it, the economy and inflation. And this cost of living is a direct result of the contributing factor of the amount of overspending and national debt that's leading to $36 trillion in national debt. And of course, then the Fed prints that. They go out and buy some of that debt on the secondary market, print more money. And then we see our cost of living, our purchasing power goes down as cost of living goes up. And we've got to do something about this, Tom, because it's not just our kids and grandkids. I feel like we're actually seeing this now. We're seeing bubbles, what I feel are bubbles across the economy and housing and the debt markets, that interest rates are probably too low compared to where they would be in the natural rate of interest in the marketplace. And so but I wanted to pick your brain though, Tom. How do you like to explain this or look at the different pieces so that way we can talk about, what are some of the trade-offs and therefore policy directions to try to overcome some of these obstacles?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Vance. And I think, you hit it on the head there with considering trade-offs, not just in the future. And you're right, there are trade-offs right now to it. So say, I always go back to James Buchanan's analogy where, if you're just looking at the trade-offs right now of public debt, when the government is offering treasury securities, they're offering it to private capital, and private capital buying up government debt comes at the next highest valued use of that private capital, that opportunity cost. And so Buchanan has this great analogy that it's, government taking private capital out of the private sector to use to finance public debt. It's like chopping up apple trees for firewood, and you reduce the yield of the orchard forever. You got some firewood right now, but the apple orchard yield is going to be lower forever because you chop down that tree.
Huh. I love that. I've never heard it actually, Tom, and I've read a lot of Buchanan, but I like that a lot.
I forget which one of his collected works that was in, but it was also the title of a great paper by Romina Bocha at Cato.
Oh,
and so that's how I first came across the phrase, and I was like, "Holy cow, this is right on the nose."
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was Democracy in Deficit or another one of his collected works, but it's in that Big Liberty Fund volume set.
Nice.
But yeah, it is right on the money. And, it's in his, and also in those collected works too, when he goes, who suffers when public spending's unwise and you're taking on debt for just this wasteful public spending? It's, it's not the taxpayers right now because they're enjoying spending without the tax hike.
Yeah.
It's not the investors, because even though the investors are making some sacrifice to their income now, they're going to get paid back with interest.
Yeah.
At that future date when the note fully matures.
Yeah.
It really is the taxpayers in the future, because they're the ones that have to make the genuine sacrifice to their income. That's through tax hikes, or maybe that's through inflation, because the larger the stock of debt, the more tempting it is to print it off really quickly with surprise inflation. And there's that dangerous intermingling of fiscal and monetary policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's, it doesn't seem like it's going to go away anytime soon. Although, there might be some optimism out there right now with the Department of Government Efficiency, with the DOGE, with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy talking about, what they could do. And hopefully some deregulation is in there as well. And I think that's one kind of optimism. I'm concerned, with the Trump administration coming in, as I was part of the first Trump administration for a year, to really get the president, Donald Trump, interested in spending cuts or even restraint. That this is not his forte. That's not at the front of his mind. He's more, he's more of a populist in that sense, where he wants to give handouts instead, tax cuts for these people, handouts on this side, so that way you can win re-election. But this might be a good opportunity though, Tom, of having some outsiders like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy with the DOGE to say, look, here are some key items. I think we already know a lot of them, right? Like, you've written about this. I've written about this. The GAO has reports on this. CBO has reports. So there's a lot of good information that's out there. It's a matter of having the political will to do something about it. I mean, and what's concerning is that Trump has already said that Medicare and Social Security are probably off the table. And if you don't include those, which is 2/3 of the budget, you're not going to be able to do much to the overall size and scope of government. But maybe, just maybe, Vivek and Elon can convince him otherwise. Because look, if if they do come out with these big reforms that say is okay, we can cut $2 trillion in spending or something, the president can use the bully pulpit and say, you know what, Congress, I'm going to veto every one of your bills until you do these reforms. I mean, there are ways that he can do that, along with doing a lot of the deregulation, which would probably be executive order for a while. Although I'd like to get away from all these executive orders, actually Congress to do their job. But there might be a good opportunity. What are you thinking about the DOGE and different things that you see in DC right now?
Well, that's it. I'm cautiously optimistic about the DOGE, and similar to what you were saying, it's, you can't ignore the elephants in the room, Social Security and Medicare. And I think it would be a positive development if we see them crack down on improper payments, which are both payments made in error on the government side as well as fraudulent payments.
Yeah.
But I think, it's not just an effort that happens at the federal level, though. It also needs to happen at the states. And we're coming out of quite the mess between the pandemic emergency spending and the ramping up spending of the previous administration. And one of the big things there, when you look at Medicaid too, is that in order to get some of this federal funding, states were not allowed to do enrollment audits on many of these social service programs, which allowed spending to boom. Many people who weren't qualified to receive these funds receive them anyway. And of course, there's the famous story out of California where you had folks who didn't even live in the United States receiving unemployment insurance bonus checks. And now their unemployment insurance trust fund is on borrowed money. Mm-hmm. And that's putting pressure on employers. It's putting pressure on businesses because they have to pay an extra tax to refill the unemployment insurance trust fund for California. So like you said, though, I am cautiously optimistic about DOGE, but I would also like to see some sort of DOGE happening at the state level. If we also had 50 little DOGEs in addition to the federal DOGE. Yeah. And you and I have written about this too. You want fiscal rules in place. You want strong fiscal rules, strong monetary rules. Like you said, so that way, even if DOGE comes and goes, and even if a reform administration comes and goes and we go back to business as usual, you want the incentives in place so that even if the worst possible person gets that job, they find it politically profitable to do the least amount of damage. Yeah. And it's those stringent rules, like say, if you applied a taxpayer's bill of rights, which Colorado has, you applied that to the federal government, tie spending to population plus inflation growth. If it goes over that limit, you gotta give people a refund. Yep. And that would do some serious good at the federal level. Yeah. And of course, you'd also want to tie that with a monetary rule, as we mentioned, because you don't want Congress to try to work around and just lean on the money printer too. Mm-hmm. And I think one important saying that, we often said when I was at ALEC and we were on the road is that you don't want to think about these things as silver bullets. Like even something like Tabor is not a cure-all. No. You want to look at them as arrows in the quiver. And I think Colorado is a good example of this. Colorado has Tabor, which is great. But when you look at state regulations, they are, I think Mercatus ranked them as the 12th most regulated state in the country. And they are the most regulated state in the Mountain West region. And so what they could learn from say from Missouri, which also, believe it or not, has a tax and expenditure limit known as the Hancock Amendment, which is a little different from Tabor and not quite as strong. Yeah. But Missouri has some very stringent regulatory reforms and a regulatory review commission. And Missouri is relatively low on on regulations. And so that's where we could I always like looking at the state perspective where states can learn from one another. Yep. Tabor's great, and you want people to be able to keep the money that they earned. You want to keep government accountable to the people, but Tabor is not a magic wand. It can't fix everything. It's not going to make everything free. You still have to be mindful of what's going on in the state capitals. You still have to be mindful of what's going on in DC. So I'm glad you brought up that regulatory reform point, Vance, because that's one thing. And it's not a knock on Tabor, but Tabor just can't, Tabor doesn't cover, say, regulations. Yeah. And that's why it's good to have something like Tabor, but you ignore other free market reforms at your own peril.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful, man. I think, no, you're exactly right. I mean, as you know, I'm a huge fan of Tabor. I think that they've weakened it over time, though, from court cases and also progressives moving in. But even with those weaknesses, they've done a pretty good job of keeping spending in check from moving from a red to a purple to a blue state.
Exactly.
That's been a key reform that I think every state should do, including the federal government.
Exactly,
And you and I have written about that on looking at fiscal rules, but also tying that to a monetary rule, because if you get the fiscal house in order, that probably means the monetary house won't be in order. And if you get the monetary house in order, you're probably unlikely to have a fiscal house that's in order. Yep. So I think we need to remove as much discretion from these fallible individuals, just like we all are. But they're rational, as going back into public choice economics and Buchanan, is that they just have different marginal costs and marginal benefits because they got to win re-election.
Exactly.
And so we need as many restraints on them and in government as possible. I think too, to your point, is a great point, by the way, on deregulation here, is that what if we had a regulatory budget to where every year there was a limit on regulations or some sort of regulatory rule? I mean, President Trump did a good job, I think, in the 2-for-1. There actually ended up being 5-for-1. For every one new regulation, there were 5 that were removed. But the problem is that the final cost of those rules was actually still positive, according to the American Action Forum. Now, not nearly like the $1.8 trillion that the Biden administration went in. I think it was like $3 billion. So it was much lower than that. But I think when we think about cutting regulations, we think about cutting the total cost. I would like to see that number be negative, not even a positive or zero. And so maybe there's a regulatory budget sort of idea that we should be thinking about next. Tom, what do you think?
Oh yeah, I'm all for that. Regulatory budgets, sunset provisions, regulatory review commission. So those sunset provisions, for those out there in radio land, that means a regulation expires after a certain number of years or a certain period of time, unless, of course, the legislature or the executive takes action to try to justify that.
Yes.
And say, okay, maybe we need this. But then the burden of proof is on them to prove why they need to keep that regulation in place for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
And so requiring sunsets, having in those guardrails, really reining in regulations. And, I agree with you there. That's something that I am optimistic about the incoming Trump administration, is seeing more regulatory reform.
Yeah.
And, some of the folks too that are getting appointed to, or some folks that are hopefully sticking around, will push back against, things like ESG in the Securities Exchange Commission, push back against all sorts of mission creep that's going on, whether it's in the Federal Reserve or in these different agencies. And even with the recent overturn of the Chevron deference at the Supreme Court, hopefully, that means, of course, this is not all's well that ends well.
Yeah.
But eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, right? Hopefully the ball is moving in the right direction. And of course, there's some things I'm not crazy about with the incoming administration, but there's some things that I am cautiously optimistic about, because I find in politics and policy, cautiously optimistic is sometimes the best you can get, right?
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk about some of those things that maybe we have a little bit more pushback on. I think that some of the key things that I'm concerned about are the protectionism, the tariffs, and raising taxes on people. Really is what a tariff is doing, is raising the tax on Americans. But then there's also kind of trade wars, and without understanding that a lot of these imports that we have are intermediate goods, and nearly half of the $3 trillion of imports are intermediate goods, which means it just goes in a compounding effect of cost throughout the production cycle, or they just cut workers and hours, so it hurts workers in the process. So either way, we're paying for it. And then those trade wars lead to even worse problems over time. And then you have this latest idea of, the capping interest rates for credit cards, which you've written about. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And then, the spending is the other big thing that I'm worried about, where, and the other one too, that I'm kind of concerned about. I'd love to get your thoughts to this too, Tom, is AI, artificial intelligence, or big tech and social media. It just seems like, there's this push for government to be the parents of kids versus letting us be kids, and not empowering parents to be parenting our kids. And that's another big thing that I'm concerned about. But what about you? What are you thinking?
Oh yeah, you definitely hit on a lot of those. And of course, my biggest concern is that saying, at least it was on the campaign trail, that they're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, which are the biggest spending issues. But, those credit card interest caps where it's that impetus. And I think the sentiment is genuine that,
sure,
somebody like Senator Hawley or Senator Sanders or President Trump, they see Americans are struggling financially. They see this as an option of helping them, but it could end up leading to some pretty disastrous consequences because interest rates are a price cap. And, when, like any other price cap, when you're limiting what information is available, because at the end of the day, a price tells us how much of something is available and how badly other people want it. And so when prices are allowed to freely communicate, as you know, it communicates to both buyers and sellers, and they adjust their expectations. They adjust their priorities. Okay, maybe I don't spend this much, or maybe I do or don't take on this loan. And that's the same thing with, say, loanable funds. And when you look at interest is actually, I write a little bit about this, and this harkens back to Walter Williams's class. He gave the example that, interest rates are a natural phenomenon. It's a natural product of human interaction like any other price. Imagine if we were to go to a country that had effectively outlawed interest. You could still get a good sense of of market interest rates by looking at the difference between what you'd call the present price of a present good versus the present price of the future good. But what does that look like? You look at two different products, milk and cheese. Milk is a present good, and of course you need milk. You need milk to make cheese, and the cheese would be the future good. If you're looking at the ratio of those prices, the price of milk versus the price of cheese, if the price of cheese is higher, interest rates, you could get a good guess that interest rates are relatively high. However, if the price of milk is greater than the price of cheese, interest rates are relatively low. And so allowing sort of that availability, allowing those prices to be freely communicated will make both people's willingness to lend and people's willingness to borrow be coordinated in the best possible way. And I would say the most in a more efficient way than, say, in a command and control system where you have this cap.
Yeah.
And so those decisions are made on non-price margins, or sometimes just made in the dark, depending on how much control there is. And if you're putting a cap and saying you can't charge interest rates, what credit card companies can do is they can change credit limits at will.
Yes.
So let's say you cap it at 10%, but my credit card interest rate was 20%. My credit card company might turn around and say, well, given these changes in circumstances, we are severely lowering your credit limit. And what happens if the amount I've borrowed is now over the new limit? I'm in trouble.
Yeah. And
in the same respect, it might close off some people completely to access to credit, is where they might want a credit card company might, look at them. And when you're making a decision on interest rates, you look at a number of factors, the people's ability to pay back through credit scores, through available credit overall, through the conditions of the market. And so when you're not allowed to factor in all of those things and you say, okay, I'm stuck at charging 10%, I might not loan to this person at all.
Right.
And that disproportionately affects low income Americans. And so that means they may end up going to, organized crime or these sort of black market credit, black market credit sources, say you think about getting a mafia loan.
Yeah.
And so that really will put people out. And, even, all of the good intentions in the world don't yield good outcomes. And, even this bill that is aimed at helping Americans are going to end up hurting them. Yeah. And it's similar to what you were saying about the tariffs. But as far as AI and internet regulation too, that is quite a thorny issue. I graduated high school in 2010. So, between 2006 and 2010, you see this huge blow up in social media, at least among my high school class. You go from things like AOL Instant Messenger, and then MySpace was really big. And then Facebook opened up to more than just college students, and you didn't need a university email. And it was really it was a wild thing to see. And for a lot of us, like you have unsupervised internet time. And even if, say my parents were regulating my internet use, you end up going to the kid's house who has the least amount of parental supervision.
Yeah.
And so that's that doesn't have an easy answer to it. And I don't think writing a law or having some sort of government age verification is going to fix that.
No.
And so, like you said, I'm concerned about, the government intervention. How well is it actually going to work? And then what will it open the door to in the future?
Yes.
As you think about that and you think about government using, the legal justifications to really get in there and to really get into people's homes, to really get into their parenting decisions, what does that open the door to in the future? And, maybe some listeners might say, well, I'm fine with the Trump administration doing that, but what about the next opposition? What about the next, say, you might say a swamp creature comes in?
Yeah.
Somebody they're totally against,
Yeah.
Or, just something else. And, what's that going to look like? And that's something that's been helpful, at least in the policy lens, when I'm trying to describe policy is, imagine this policy being carried out by your nightmare administration.
Yeah. Right.
I remember hearing when I was at Alex, some folks talking about, oh, well, what if the states, took more control over monetary policy? And so this is a couple of years ago. And I said, imagine, and this is so a couple of years ago. So imagine Mayor Bill de Blasio, then the mayor of New York City, walking into the New York Federal Reserve, giving them a piece of his mind and the Fed actually listening. Like, what kind of world would we be living in? And then all of a sudden that extreme example really gave people pause. Like, I want you to think of it like that.
Yeah.
Don't think about how you would do something. Think about, the worst possible person for the job. How would that person do this job?
Yeah.
And that goes back to what we were saying. You want to make it politically profitable to do the least amount of damage.
Yeah.
So whenever you're thinking about a policy, why doesn't government just do X? And I think that's also something I learned, it was in 12th grade AP US government. My teacher, Mr. Bachman, had said, if your question starts with, why don't we just ... you're not appreciating the complexity of the situation.
Yeah. Yep. I love it, Tom. Great, wise words there, as usual. And I think you're exactly right. How whether it be tariffs or capping interest rates on credit cards or student loan forgiveness, we didn't even talk about that. But or government trying to rule over. Basically, what I say is it's politicians and bureaucrats that we're empowering over our kids instead of parents, which we should be empowering parents to do what's best online. And maybe government has a role of providing information like they do on other things, saying, hey, here's some of the potential cost. But otherwise, I think they should get out of the way. And that's on so many things. And it's probably why we're more classical liberals, and things of that nature. But I think that what we want to do is to let people prosper and find ways to do that. So, we're going to have to wrap up here, unfortunately, because we could talk all day and you should come back on.
Oh,
but I wondered, what would you like to leave us with, Tom, on anything that state or congressional members up in DC or local officials? What are some of the key things that you'd want to get across? And then where are the best places to find you?
So I'd say the key things there is that remembering public debt is that tax on future generations. And it's also the tax on us. Like I said, it's taking away opportunities from us now, and it's also taking away opportunities from our kids and our grandkids. And that's how you should think about public debt and, when you're considering it. And then you could find me on the AIER website, aier.org, and our new website, The Daily Economy, thedailyeconomy.org as well.
I love that one. All right. Good stuff, Tom. Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing and for being a great friend over the years. And I look forward to working with you more, and God bless you and your family. And we're having this before Christmas. So Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. All the best to your family as well, Vance. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much, Tom. Well, for the audience, thank y'all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. You've got to make sure that you overcome your failures and learn lessons from the past of economic history and just history in general. And those are some of the great things that Tom works on all the time. Make sure also to check out my information at vanceginn.com and get all the show notes at vanceginn.substack.com. Well, until next time, God bless you and let people prosper.